So thanks everybody for coming. It's Alumni Week here at SAIS. We were privileged earlier this week to have Ambassador Ted Osius come and talk to us, and today we're especially privileged to have Ambassador Marianne Peters here to give the Betty Lou Hummel lecture. It's a real pleasure for me. You hear me say this all the time because I'm privileged to have had so many great colleagues during my career, but it's an especially great privilege to have Marianne give this very distinguished lecture. She has had an extraordinary career, first as, I think, 30 years or so as a member of the Foreign Service and doing what Foreign Service officers do, is rising through the ranks and achieving really extraordinary positions, ending her career as ambassador to Bangladesh. But before that had served in many senior positions, both at the White House and the State Department. And she and I got to know each other during this period of time, having done many important projects together, many of which I think we both share a sense of both struggle and achievement, about one of the most important of which was the critical role that she helped play in the Northern Ireland peace process, where we worked very closely together. But she played an important role in so many other aspects of American foreign policy during the many important positions she played, including as the number 2 at our embassy in Canada and so many other important positions. But not satisfied with that, this was only the beginning of the story. And after a stint at the Marshall Center in Germany, she went on to play an extraordinary role in a number of different positions. She first, which is very much appreciated here at SAIS, became provost at the Naval War College, which is a really fascinating and interesting position, I'm sure, for a civilian to play, but a very important institution of higher education for our naval officers, and a very distinguished group of both civilians and military officers who serve in the faculty there, but it's always a challenge being a provost. And then she went from there to another extraordinary position, which is to run the Carter Center. And I know many of you will be familiar with the extraordinary work that the Carter Center does and the important role that Marianne played there. And then finally, after stepping down from the Carter Center, is now a professor of practice at Georgia State. So, spanning so many different capacities, so many different roles, she's really brings a wealth of experience to this position. And so I want to ask you to join me in welcoming Ambassador Marianne Peters.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to see Jim again, and I'm really glad that SAIS is able to benefit from his really extraordinary experience, both in government and academia. And welcome to all of you. Today is Yom Kippur, so Happy New Year to those of you who are Jewish. It's really great to be back at SAIS. When I was a student here, my roommate and I lived just a few blocks away, and I had an internship across the street at Brookings doing research on law of the sea issues. Really kind of a perfect student experience. But it was the fellowship I received to spend my first year at the SAIS campus in Bologna that lured me to SAIS. When I got the call offering the fellowship, the visions dancing in my head were not of foreign policy, macroeconomics, European history. They were more like travel, adventure, taglia alla bolognese. But if I came to SAIS for some of the wrong reasons, I quickly realized that by sheer luck, I'd landed in the right place. The SAIS curriculum opened a window on the wider world for me, and that eventually led to my joining the Foreign Service. What I particularly liked about the SAIS program back then was the emphasis on economics and the language requirement. I'm actually glad to see that you still have to demonstrate proficiency in a language to graduate. That may sound old-fashioned, but in my experience, learning the language is the best gateway to understanding another culture. And you can't create common cause or negotiate successfully unless you can do that. Which brings me to today's lecture in honor of Betty Lou Hummel, a woman who got up to attend Arabic language classes at 5 o'clock in the morning when she was a student here in 1946. And Betty Lou graduated in the first SAIS class. And after that, she went to Istanbul, where she taught for 3 years before returning to the US. I believe she met and married her husband, Foreign Service Officer Arthur Hummel, when she got back from Istanbul. Now, Betty Lou accompanied Art to his overseas posts, and she did all the unpaid work that Foreign Service wives did back then, and continued to teach as well. In between my own graduation from college in 1972, yeah, go ahead, do the math, and when I graduated in 1974 from SAIS, a door opened that had been closed to Betty Lou and to most women. Until 1972, no married woman had served in the Foreign Service. Even if a woman had managed to pass the oral examination, where her gender was apparent and therefore the bar was quite high, she had to resign if she got married. So when I entered the Foreign Service in January of 1975, 6 of the women in my entering class were women who had been forced to leave the Foreign Service for that reason, and had chosen to accept the State Department's invitation to return at the rank they had when they left. One of those women, named Connie, had been in the service in the late 40s. So she would have been about Betty Lou Hummel's age, I think. And Connie was 58 when she accepted the invitation to rejoin the Foreign Service as a vice consul, a junior rank, just to have the experience she'd missed out on 3 decades before. I don't think Betty Lou herself was someone who looked back with regret, but I find that I'm somewhat regretful on her behalf that one of the most rewarding ways of putting a SAIS education to use was closed to her. So in memory of Betty Lou Hummel and her intrepid engagement in the world, I'm honored to be here today to talk about why America matters. There's no way to sugarcoat this. The world is more dangerous now than at any time since I graduated from SAIS and joined the Foreign Service. And I say that having spent the first part of my career during the Cold War working on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for a good bit of that time. Yes, it was definitely dangerous to have 2 heavily armed nuclear powers engaged in a global struggle to determine how the world would be organized. That period saw many dangerous moments, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the collapse of the Soviet Union, because no matter how positive, cataclysmic change is always dangerous. 2 wars against Iraq, the second of which destabilized the Middle East neighborhood dangerously, and the attacks on September 11th, 2001, which redefined national security and left us struggling to combat terrorism, not a traditional enemy, but essentially a tactic. But the backdrop to the risks we faced in the 20th century and in the first years of the 21st century was a world that was actually getting better for more and more people. The 3 trends, megatrends, that illustrate that improvement are the decline in poverty, a decline in conflict, and the spread of democracy. The biggest story of the period was the economic story, the rise of a much larger middle class, mainly in India and China, and a sharp reduction in the number of people living in extreme poverty, which SAIS students know is defined by the World Bank as living on less than $1.90 a day. As recently as 1990, 35% of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. Today, even after the reverses caused by COVID, that figure is less than 10%. And that means better lives for literally billions of people, better food, better health, better education. The other 2 megatrends that were making the world arguably a better place until recently were the spread of democracy and a steady reduction in the number of people killed in conflict. Starting in the 1970s, many countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia began democratic transitions. And for 30 years, both the number of democracies and the quality of democracy increased and improved. But sadly, the democratization trend was the first of the three to switch direction and start to decline. According to Freedom House, 2022 marks the 15th year of the trend away from greater freedom and democracy. What worries me is not just the threat of authoritarianism, but its increasing respectability. You know, back in the day when I was a diplomat, autocrats generally wanted to be seen as legitimately elected leaders and even as proponents of human rights. And sometimes that hypocrisy actually allowed us to leverage improvements in rights and liberties. Now it seems to me the autocrats are unapologetic and unfettered. Just to pile on with evidence of the rise of authoritarianism, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance issued a recent report noting that more than a quarter of the people in the world now live under governments that are backsliding in terms of democracy, including some of the world's largest democracies. Brazil and India come to mind, and 3 members of the European Union, Hungary, Poland, and Slovenia. Together with those living under non-democratic regimes, they make up more than 2/3 of the world's population. Now, the third positive trend was a decline in the number of people killed in conflict, which could serve as a rough measure of the spread of peace. That trend started after the carnage of World War II, in which probably 80 million people died. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the wars between Iran and Iraq and in Afghanistan in the 80s reversed the trend temporarily. But after the Cold War, we saw declines in the number of so-called battle deaths in most years. The first decade of this century was the most peaceful period in history, according to the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. That ended when the conflict in Syria started in 2011. And the trend was rising again, even before Russia invaded Ukraine earlier this year. So the democratization trend reversed in 2007. What you might call the peace trend reversed in 2011. What about the most impactful of the three, the decline in poverty? Well, that trend was reversed by COVID, a reversal that may or may not prove temporary. About 100 million people were pushed back into extreme poverty during COVID. And most of these people who lost their tenuous grasp on a slightly better life are women, who make up 70% of the world's poor. This is bad news, not just for those women and the children they care for, but for all of us. Because it turns out that investing in women is the most effective investment we can make in a better future for everyone. I'll give a few examples from a very large body of research that supports that conclusion. Greater gender equality is associated with better education and health, higher per capita income, and faster and more inclusive growth. And those are benefits that accrue to men and boys as well as to women and girls. In developing countries, most farmers are women. If women farmers had the same access to resources like land and fertilizer that men have, agricultural production in those countries could increase by 4% or more. That's something to keep in mind as we face a looming food crisis. Evidence from many countries shows that when women control a greater percentage of the household income, usually because they've just gotten jobs, more money is spent on food and education for the children. The setback in the decline of poverty, which affects women disproportionately, has interrupted other positive trends as well. Sad to say, progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, has stalled. But when I say that the world is more dangerous now than at any time I can recall, I mean much more than just the end of the good news on poverty, peace, and democracy. We're now faced with a set of existential, interconnected threats that under worst-case scenarios could actually set the human race back centuries. I'm going to highlight 4 of them briefly, starting with what I believe is the greatest threat, climate change. We all know this. Climate change is happening fast, too fast for humans to adapt without immense upheaval and probably conflict. The countries that will suffer most are not the countries that largely caused this problem. Most Americans and Europeans will not be forced to leave their homes, as will millions of people in the Pacific, in Africa, and in Asia. But the cost of climate change will burden us too in many ways, even if we wake up in time to avert the very worst outcomes. Another existential threat is nuclear war, and we've been living with that one for decades. And sometimes we seem to forget that we still live in the nuclear age. The danger we faced in the Cold War is still here, and this time, many of the nukes are in the hands of Vladimir Putin. Give me Khrushchev or Brezhnev over Putin any day. They at least were constrained by their near peers in the Politburo. As far as I can tell, Putin has no near peers, no colleagues, and no constraints. The global non-proliferation regime, based on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, has been fraying for years, but I actually think it has done a pretty good job. We had 5 nuclear powers in 1970 when the NPT entered into force, and today we have 9. The US, Russia, China, the UK, France, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, and of course, Iran could well be the 10th. If Ukraine had it to do over again, do you think they would give up the nuclear weapons that were stationed on their soil during the Soviet period? That's what they did in 1994 in exchange for security assurances that have turned out to be insufficient, shall we say. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has made it obvious that there is nothing, not even the support of the United States of America, that is as good for defending your country as having nuclear weapons. That lesson will not be lost on governments in hotspots all around the world. And I'm afraid we'll see more governments seek to acquire nukes in defiance of the NPT. And a world with more nuclear arsenals is a more dangerous world. Now let's talk about pandemics, the third of the threats that concern me the most. In the 14th century, the Black Plague killed an estimated 30 to 50% of the people in Europe. Pandemics will continue to pose an existential threat, and climate change is actually making it more likely that the next pandemic is just around the corner. During my time at the Carter Center, I was privileged to get to know a number of global public health experts. Epidemiologists will tell you 2 things about pandemics. The first is that there will be another one, not if, but when. And the second is that the next pandemic disease is likely to be deadlier than COVID. And COVID has already taken 6.5 million lives worldwide and more than 1 million here in the US. We've lost a lot of people to COVID. But if we had been dealing with Ebola, for instance, instead of COVID for the past 2.5 years, there really wouldn't be many of us left. New infectious diseases are often what's called zoonotic, meaning they are transmitted from animals to humans. According to a recent study funded by the National Science Foundation, quote, as Earth's climate continues to warm, researchers predict that wild animals will be forced to relocate their habitats, likely to regions with large human populations, dramatically increasing the risk of a viral jump to humans that could lead to the next pandemic. That's actually just one of the many ways in which today's threats are dangerously interconnected. Now, the fourth and final threat I want to talk about today is the renewed threat of major power conflict. Since the Korean War, we've seen very few armed conflicts between states and none between major powers. And that's obviously one reason why the number of battle deaths declined. There were some wars between states. We had the war between Iran and Iraq in the 80s, and the First and Second Gulf Wars. But most conflicts have been civil wars, often with outside interference, but grounded in internal disputes. These conflicts, like the civil wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia in the 1990s, and the more recent internationalized civil conflicts in Syria and Yemen, are tragically destructive for the populations involved. In this kind of armed conflict, human rights go right out the window. But far fewer people are involved in these conflicts than in wars between and among major powers, so fewer people die. Now, military planners naturally continued to plan for the eventuality of armed conflict with Russia or China, but 10 years ago, neither seemed likely at all. And two developments have brought back the real possibility of a war between large, well-armed states. One, of course, is the Russian attack on Ukraine in February, which upended the world order. The other is the trend in the United States toward focusing on competition with China rather than cooperation. Now, both competition and cooperation will obviously be part of any U.S. policy toward China, but for the last few years, spurred by the hardline policies of Xi Jinping, U.S. policymakers have understandably been concentrating more on the competition aspect. As I said, that's understandable given China's behavior, but personally, I worry that we've fallen too easily back into the comfortable paradigm of great power competition. President Biden has said that the U.S. would come to the aid of Taiwan in the event of an attack by China. And I understand the argument for clarity, and I wasn't part of the policy discussion, so there's a lot I don't know. But I have to say, personally, I felt safer with the strategic ambiguity of earlier administrations. So the risk that we will enter into armed conflict with Russia or China, or heaven forbid both of them, is greater than at any time I can remember. And major power conflict is more dangerous than ever because it would be fought, at least in part, in cyberspace. In spite of the many treaties that make it illegal to attack civilian targets in wartime, it seems to me unlikely that combatants would exercise much restraint in cyberspace. And as you all know, cyber attacks on civilian targets, such as the power grid, food and water supplies, transportation systems, would drastically alter the living conditions and possibly even the political systems as a result in targeted countries. Then there is the attribution problem that could cause disastrous mistakes to be made in the heat of combat. In the old days, the very old days, you could see the enemy army coming and you knew, of course, who it was. But in cyberspace, attribution is difficult. Heaven help us if we respond to an attack that seemed to come from Russia and later find out it came from a hacker in Argentina. And I know I'm exaggerating, but the attribution problem is very real. As we face existential threats from climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, and major power rivalry, we need to ask, what can America do to make our own country and the world safer? In other words, why does America matter? On one level, the answer is very simple. We are big and strong and rich, and throughout history, big, strong, rich countries have had an outsized influence on their neighbors and on the world. And obviously, America matters at that level. So do China and Russia. And if you wince at being lumped with China and Russia, as I do, then we need to look deeper for a reason why we matter. Is it just because we have the world's largest economy, the world's largest military, and a large, relatively well-educated population sitting on a large landmass? Or could there be other reasons? Well, a second answer is grounded during that not so long ago time when U.S. leadership shaped a world that was becoming freer, richer, and more peaceful. We matter, I think, because we wore the mantle of leadership during a period of progress, and we wore it pretty well. Not perfectly, but pretty well. We often congratulate ourselves on the international system that the U.S. and its allies, but mainly the U.S., created after World War II. And it was quite an achievement. SAIS was founded in 1946, just after or just before the great post-war institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which morphed into the WTO, and NATO. But that post-war system is under pressure today, and those institutions, as they currently function, are unlikely to be able to lead the way as we search for solutions to our current problems. Also after the war, in 1948, the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The chair of the commission that drafted the UDHR was an American, Eleanor Roosevelt. The preface to the declaration begins with, quote, "Recognition of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family," which is a clear echo of the Declaration of Independence. And this brings us to another reason why America matters. The United States is the only country founded on an idea, not the bonds of kinship, language, and culture that bind most other nations. America is the place where the idea that human rights are inalienable and universal first found political expression, even if our founding fathers extended those rights only to white men of property. One of my favorite books is called The Idea That Is America by Anne Marie Slaughter, published in 2007. Also in 2007, Professor Slaughter published a short essay in The Atlantic called Unexceptionalism, a response to the divisive concept of American exceptionalism. I'd like to read to you from that essay. "The American idea is the idea of a nation founded on a set of universal values, self-evident truths that are ascribed to all human beings by virtue of their common humanity. It is the idea of a nation whose destiny was to demonstrate to the peoples of all nations that a government based on these values could in fact succeed. We were blessed to be the first nation to steer a successful course between, in James Madison's view, the extremes of tyranny and direct democracy. But we would fail in our destiny if we proved to be the only such nation. The American idea was a great idea because it rested on the essential and revolutionary notion of the universality of the human condition. This idea is still great today and now genuinely global, but as the people who have done so much to nurture this idea, we face a paradox. To see it continue and to flourish, we have to accept that it is no longer exclusively or exceptionally ours. Circumstances have changed since Professor Slaughter wrote that in 2007. As I said earlier, the tide of democracy turned that year, and we are now 15 years into its ebb. And our own democracy is so visibly under threat that other nations may not see us as the embodiment of self-government based on universal values. But even now, and maybe I'm kidding myself, but even now, I sense a nostalgia for the days when the United States, in spite of its own manifest flaws, stood for and stood up for the great universal human aspirations, liberty, equality, justice. A fourth, more prosaic reason why America matters, or why America could matter, is that Americans tend to be good at out-of-the-box thinking and innovation. Here's a quote I like from the most recent edition of the Goalkeepers Report from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. "Human ingenuity can render our careful projections irrelevant and make our boldest aspirations appear timid." Now, according to the World Economic Forum, the United States is only number 3 in innovation after Switzerland and Sweden. but we are certainly the most innovative country that is also big and strong. The US is not only good at incremental innovation, and lots of patents are for incremental improvements to existing products or technologies, but we're also pretty good at brand new ideas. Our huge free market is adept at generating solutions to big and little problems on its own or in partnership with government. The United States is still the only nation whose citizens have walked on the moon. Americans invented the lending library, the drinking fountain, the light bulb, the microwave oven, and potato chips, among many other life-changing products. And when we generate new ideas to capture carbon emissions, or accelerate the vaccine cycle, or make cyberspace safer, we have the economic and diplomatic resources to take these ideas to scale globally. Finally, America matters because most Americans believe we can shape our own destiny, and we're willing to work hard at doing that. In 2015, the Pew Research Center did a study of how Americans actually stand out from the rest of the world. And that study highlighted two characteristics: self-reliance and a strong work ethic. In that study, 57% of Americans disagreed with the following statement: success in life is pretty much determined by forces outside our control. And that's a higher percentage than most countries and well above the global average of 38%. And when asked on a scale of 1 to 10 how important working hard is for getting ahead in life, 73% of Americans gave it a 10, compared to 50% in the other 44 countries surveyed. So, America matters in the world because we are big and strong and rich, because we created the world order that made life better for billions of people, because we're founded on the idea of universal rights, because our immense free market economy is very good at innovation, and because we believe we can change our circumstances and we work hard to do that. And you know what? Given the scale of the problems that confront us, there is really just no alternative to American leadership. To be welcome, American leadership needs to be exercised with fairness and humility. To be effective, we have to engage differently. We'll have to bring new countries into the dialogue and listen to ideas not invented here. We'll have to prioritize women, not just because it's the fair thing to do, but because that is the single most impactful change we can make to generate the ideas and the resources to respond to the threats we face. And most difficult of all, we'll have to take the long view and set aside short-term political advantage. We've done it before, but not in a while. Could the U.S. provide the leadership to meet our current challenges? Yes. Will it? I just don't know. We are a nation deeply divided. Winston Churchill said, "The price of greatness is responsibility." Or, as Uncle Ben told Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, "With great power comes great responsibility." Those of you who are students are inheriting a set of problems that you did not create. I hope that you will accept the responsibility for solving them. No matter where you're from, I hope you'll choose to engage in the world and bring your best efforts to the resolution of the serious problems that we all face. And a special request to those of you who are Americans. I hope you too will choose to matter in the world, and I hope you will work hard to make sure that America matters, and matters in a way that will make us all proud. Thank you.
So that was elegant and delightful and really thoughtful and impressive and really reflected so many different aspects of your own career and your own experience, drawing on the work that you've done as a diplomat, at the Carter Center, and your experience with global public health issues, your insight into Russia and Putin and all of the above. And it just really shows how that kind of experience and that kind of engagement really contributes to a very rich analytic perspective, which you've shown in your life as an academic. So all good and much appreciated here. So thank you for that. And I'm also very fond of quoting what I call the Peter Parker principle as well. So that had a lot of resonance for me. So I want to begin. There are a lot of questions here, and mostly I want to leave it to the audience, but let me just begin the conversation by asking you about diplomacy, right? So you've talked about a lot of things that have changed. Many of them have not changed for the better, right? And if you look around the world, diplomacy does not seem to be in very high focus or prioritization right now. We don't have any real diplomacy associated with the situation in Ukraine. Many people would argue, and I'd certainly be one of them, that in U.S.-China relations, there are issues about the level and the role of diplomacy. We see this, and now appears once again the breakdown in the negotiations with Iran over the nuclear deal. We've had another test in North Korea, and nothing happened, and so on and so on and so on. So, from the perspective of a distinguished career diplomat at high levels, what is diplomacy dead? I mean, to be controversial here. And if not, I mean, what will it take for this to once again take a significant place in terms of dealing with these deep challenges that you talked about?
Well, Here's a mic. Oh, thank you. My voice tends to project, but it's probably better to use the mic. I'm going to be indiscreet and undiplomatic and do something I never would have done at the time. But I think that it's difficult to expect much of the under-resourced American diplomatic apparatus that we have. And this started, again, when Secretary of State Baker decided not to ask for an injection of resources into the State Department to support and staff the embassies that came into existence as a direct result of our victory in the Cold War. So I remember being on the phone telling people who were happy, as they should have been, that a struggle that was largely a diplomatic struggle and had been won was leading to phone calls from me saying, I'm really sorry, I know you only have 3 political officers, but you have to make do with 1 or 2, and so and that was during the Clinton administration. So I guess this is a bipartisan criticism. I just think it's always been too easy to deprive the State Department of resources. And this, it's kind of a hackneyed complaint. Most FSOs talk about this. Most of us know by heart little comparisons like there are more musicians in the military than there are U.S. diplomats. I could go on, but you get the idea. It's true, though. So my first answer would be that diplomacy has been under-resourced, and just keeping the lights on is something of a struggle. And yet, if you look at the number of issues that constitute a diplomatic agenda, the number of issues has just exploded. We were talking earlier about health. I mean, in 1975, no one would talk about health. They wouldn't have talked about environmental issues or many other things that we now have to talk about with the same resources. But on a different level, I should stop complaining as a former FSO about the eternal problem of lack of resources and say that I also think we diplomats, haven't been as innovative as we should have been in terms of how to exercise power, how to make other people do what we want them to do without firing a shot. That's what diplomats do. And how to do that, how to be more effective, how to, use that lever to lift the world. Who was that? Archimedes? Okay. How to do that.
Be a place to stand.
Yeah, exactly. So I would have to say that we have responsibility for that. We've been very slow to come to social media. I think the State Department does that now, but I'd like to lead instead of follow on a lot of these technologies and other innovations that would allow diplomats to be more effective. Some problems aren't ready for diplomacy. We talked about Bosnia. Sadly, there's this cynical, almost, concept of ripeness in conflict resolution, which means...
Be careful, because Bill Zartman might show up in the audience here somewhere. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, that's right, I'm at SAIS. But the idea that when people think they can win the war, they just as soon win as stop fighting. That means there's a timing issue, let's say, here. So I'm not sure that that I would expect diplomacy to be front and center in Ukraine at this point. But there are many, many problems that I think we need to work on with far more energy and zest. I think cyberspace is grossly under-diplomatized. I think we need a cadre of people to start looking around the world and to try to get, well, not Russia, but maybe even China on board with some agreements that would limit activities that all governments frown on. There is a European, it's a Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, but really, when you look at the way the 3D world is organized, we have a suite of agreements on everything from extradition to legislation on human trafficking that we just don't match in cyberspace. Thank you.
Great. So the next thing I want to ask you about from your remarks is this question about universality, right? And the idea that what makes our ideals distinct is the universality, and the claim that it isn't. We aren't just unique in this respect. And of course, it's been a great debate in all of the history of American foreign policy. As I told you, I do teach this here. Going back to John Quincy Adams' famous July 4th address, which is that when it comes to freedom and democracy, we would be the well-wishers of all, but the defenders only of our own. And we see this today, right? I mean, you have on the one hand the Biden administration seeing and defining the struggles of our time as the struggle of democracy versus autocracy. At the same time, we see, the folks out in the street in Tehran. We see fighting for their individual rights. We see problems, including what everybody recognizes as genocide in Myanmar. And yet, there are serious questions about whether these are problems that America should have to come and deal with. So how far does it go? I mean, we certainly accept the principle of universality. What is the Peter Parker responsibility of the United States in the face of both supporting those who are fighting for them and defending those whose rights are being deprived?
Well, that, of course, is the question. And the answer is usually dependent on the context, of course. And it would be unwise to try to give a universal answer because there are so many examples that wouldn't fit. First of all, the question of the use of armed force to defend others' democracy doesn't really arise unless we're talking about an ally, I think. Although, I don't know, we're pretty close on Ukraine, aren't we? We're nibbling around the...
maybe in Taiwan?
Yeah, maybe in Taiwan. We're nibbling around the edges. But there was that period when something called the responsibility to protect was promulgated by the United Nations, which is the idea that when governments are committing genocide against their own people, that other nations have a responsibility to intervene. This, was a result to some extent of what happened in Rwanda, but it was the idea that powerful countries have an obligation to the citizens of other countries. It hasn't gone so far as to suggest that we have an obligation to defend with force their democratic aspirations, but certainly their lives. There was a period when that was really an idea that had begun to take hold. But then, here's what I understand happened. I wasn't in government, so correct me if I'm wrong. What I think happened is the US persuaded Russia and China to allow an intervention in Libya, pretty much on that basis as a humanitarian option, and then went on to do regime change, which was extremely tempting. But my understanding is Russia and China said it'll be a cold day in hell before we vote for one of those again. That's kind of, I think, what happened to R2P. You can tell me later.
I'll say a little maybe, but keep going.
All right, but the idea, it's not that people haven't thought about whether the powerful country have an obligation to protect the weak rather than exploiting them. It's that it has proved difficult in the political arena to make that a standard. I would say that the question is, to what extent should we take measures that might actually have an economic impact on ourselves and on our allies and friends in response to that kind of thing. When we're much more likely to levy economic sanctions against a country like Burma than we are to, to march in. Quite right, too, don't get me wrong, I agree with that. And I've explained to students of mine why it is that we have a different standard for Burma than we do for China. Excuse me, I served in Burma before it was Myanmar. I can't really get with the new program. But I would say that just because you can't do it all the time doesn't mean you shouldn't do it when you can. Sometimes we can't do what we'd like to do. Sometimes we can't prioritize human rights over strategic considerations, but sometimes we can, and when we can, we should.
That's great, and it is obviously a complex question. I just observe on the problem of R2P, and Libya is an example of it, that so was Bosnia and Kosovo, was that the question then becomes, if you have a genocidal or murderous regime like Gaddafi in Libya or Milosevic in Serbia, if you're serious about protecting the people, it may not be possible to protect them short of having the end of the regime, right? And so, I don't think in either case was the strategy regime change, and I don't think that was the objective in Libya, but the reality was that as long as Gaddafi was there, you were not going to be in a position, you can't just put a little bubble over people and say, well, we're going to keep the regime in place, but we'll prevent them from doing to their people what they don't want, what they're determined to do.
That, of course, is true, yes.
So let me just do one more here, and something that I think it's important for us and for our students to talk about here, which is you and I talked a little bit about, and you mentioned sort of the changes and resources at the State Department, but there's also a question about sort of the ability of career people in the government to do things. You saw, in the previous administration, claims about a deep state. You've had questions about, whether there's space for different views within the career services, experienced diplomats not being able to express their views. And so my question is, is it still possible to have the kind of career that Ambassador Marianne Peters had, which is to serve different presidents from different parties with different strategies in ways that can still be effective? Or is that ideal of the Foreign Service officer who can do their job on behalf of America, one that's maybe not so easy or even sustainable now?
Yeah, that's a real tough one, because I proudly served, presidents from both parties and did not find it difficult at all. I'm often asked by students or, interns at the Carter Center, well, what happens when you disagree with policy? And, what I usually say is, well, first of all, no one wants to know what you think or what I think. They want to know what the United States thinks. So you better be able to explain that. And the truth is that there are, in my experience, there were very few times when there were ethical issues involved. Often I found that when I disagreed with Washington, it was a tactical issue. I thought, we shared the same larger goal of peace and prosperity wherever I was serving, but I just thought they'd come up with a totally loopy way to pursue it. And I think sometimes that's true. But I never felt a problem with the information I had at the time. I was telling Jim earlier that it was a little difficult when we invaded Iraq in March of 2003, but before we found out there were no nuclear weapons there, it was perhaps less clear-cut than it later became. The question of whether we can do it now is very, very difficult. I'll just be blunt and say it would have been very difficult to serve the Trump administration on two levels, both because the policies are so very different from those that secured U.S. peace and prosperity for so many years, and because it was very difficult in some cases to take it seriously, very difficult to walk. It would have been it seems to me, difficult to walk into a foreign ministry and represent your country with a straight face, but winking and nodding across the table in the foreign ministry is extremely unprofessional. It's not what diplomats are supposed to do, but the temptation would have been overwhelming.
It's a tough problem, and yet, as you know well, and we say to our students all the time, if our best people don't go in, then there's no chance that it will get better. And so
Exactly. And I did tell students, please do go in anyway, and I told them that there were ways to get around this issue of disagreeing. But I was thinking more of, a Republican disagreeing with something a Democrat wanted to do or vice versa, not that very particular administration.
of course. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. I think we have microphones here, and we'll just, since you got the mic there, why don't you start with the two right here, and then we'll work our way around the room. Yeah, right there, those two. If you could just identify yourself.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an Intel analyst and a former FSO. I'm not so sure it's the sunset of diplomacy that we're facing. I think it's the sunrise of autocracy, which makes diplomacy so much harder. And as such, I got to ask the big question. When did we lose our mojo on fighting autocracy? Where's the secret committee at the NSC to take down Maduro? Where's the secret committee at the NSC to study methods of breaking the Great Firewall in China? Where's the secret committee at the NSC to depose the Kim family? And on and on and on. Not one of those secret committees exists, and that's the problem in the world today. Not a failure of diplomacy.
Well, I'll defer to Jim on all those secret committees. I will, but I will say that in my view, we can blame China in an indirect way, and here's what I mean. I think some of the support for democracy in the world among publics was due to a conflation in the minds of the publics between democracy and market economies. So they saw prosperous democratic countries, and they thought it was a twofer, okay? China proved it's not necessarily. They don't necessarily go hand in hand. I'm, chagrined to say that China showed that you can be more prosperous without necessarily embracing the messiness of democracy. Now I'm going to contradict myself and say, at the same time, both as a diplomat and as the CEO of the Carter Center, I have observed elections abroad in fragile democracies. Almost by definition, the Carter Center doesn't go to Denmark. And in those places, I changed my mind about the question of the development of democracy. There was a time when there was a debate in IR circles about whether elections should be first or last. Should you have the rule of law first, strong institutions? Because elections so often brought demagogues to power. Yeah, well, that happens everywhere. And this happened first in Bangladesh. And people stood in the hot sun for hours waiting to vote. Old ladies went in the morning, and if the polling places were safe, not too many young yahoos, they went back and told their daughters and daughters-in-law that it was safe for them to go out and vote. And, as I said, everybody's standing in the hot sun. I know these people were not stupid. They might have been poor, but they weren't stupid. They knew perfectly well that they were going to throw out one gang of thugs and bring in another gang of thugs. They knew that. But I became convinced that we should defend their right to stand in the hot sun once every 5 years and do that, if that's what they wanted to do. So I have become a believer in even electoral democracy, even though that's a very limited definition of democracy. But I do think there are many places in the world, and I think of Central Asia, for instance, where it was convenient to realize that you no longer had to buy democracy if you wanted to pursue prosperity.
So I can't resist on the secret committees, but I begin with what you will perhaps take as a flip comment, but if we had secret committees, they'd be secret and you wouldn't know about them, right? So don't be so sure you know. I know, but I've been there, and I've sat on some of the secret committees, and you don't know about them either. So, but the second thing I would say is I'm also a historian. And we had a secret committee that did Mossadegh. We had a secret committee that did Chetty Jagan. We had a secret committee that did Jacob Arbenz. We had a secret committee that did Pinochet, or did Allende. So we got to be careful about our secret committees. And as a democracy and in the things that we believe in, we need to think about the instrumentalization of these kinds of things and whether in the long run they serve our purposes. Right there, next question.
Hi, thank you so much again for your time. So I wanted to ask a question, I think really to both of you about Northern Ireland. And specifically in Northern Ireland, obviously the peace process is under threat right now and is having a lot of tension placed on it with the Northern Ireland Protocol and Brexit negotiations. The US has maintained a fairly consistent position there, but I was curious for your observations on how you think that will proceed and the role that the US can play in stabilizing that, and while also maintaining an alliance and a good relationship with the UK that seems set on a different course.
Well, I'm going to just answer briefly and then defer to Jim on that. It's obviously all about Brexit. John Hume, who was the leader of the SDLP in Northern Ireland, was the person who first actually convinced the US ambassador to the Republic of Ireland, Jean Kennedy Smith at the time, that Gerry Adams was serious when he offered to trade a ceasefire for a visa. I mean, I'm, shortening a long thing. John Hume's, and there's a great documentary out about John Hume, by the way. It was done a couple years ago. John Hume is the unsung hero of this process, and the reason I'm mentioning him is because his great insight, his great point was that land doesn't have rights, people do, and that under the arc of the European Union, there would be room for new and different ways of living together. So the European Union was absolutely vital to the very beginning of the peace process as a concept. It was John Hume's lever. That's what he used. But I haven't worked directly on the process in many years, although I'm chagrined by this development. But I'm frankly appalled by Brexit and all its other consequences too. But Jim.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, I had the privilege with Marianne and many others working very closely with George Mitchell and others in the process. And, so I feel a very, personal sense of both pride in what we achieved and concern about where it stands. I think, there is, a responsibility of leaders. I mean, the agreement came about because not just of the insights of John Hume, but extraordinary men and women, especially when, but I'm saying, but there, it was this coming together of so many forces, including, frankly, Tony Blair played a critical role in bringing it about, but ironically, John Major, in some ways, was as important, and as well as the Taoiseachs who made this all happen, and everybody was motivated by a very concrete sense of the danger of not reaching agreement, and as always happens in peace processes like these, we've now had 25 years of peace, right? And people they're beginning to forget a little about the danger of slipping back. It seems like it couldn't happen, right? That so you can dig in, you can be less willing to make the hard choices for peace that John always advocated for, because there's less of and there's sort of a complacency about, well, we can be uncompromising and not think about the bigger picture, because surely it'll never be back like it was. And that's, I think, so important for leaders and ordinary people and religious leaders and others to remind folks that it wasn't so long ago that children were dying on the streets, that officers were dying on the streets. And so you have to kind of find a way to keep vivid in people's mind what the alternatives are to sustaining this agreement. And I fear, as directly involved as I was in the past, that we've lost the sense of both the urgency and even for David Trimble, that making the hard choices for peace were better than letting the situation sustain it as it did. Okay, let's go over here. We got three in a row and that row there. So why don't we just start right wherever. And
Thank you very much. I'm Afshin Malavi. I'm a senior fellow here at the Foreign Policy Institute and a SAIS grad from about 20 plus years ago as well. So thank you very much for your talk. I love what you said about the importance of investing in women. And I love that language. And you know, from your experience, what has been the most effective ways to do that around the world, particularly in places where we don't have much influence? I'm thinking Iran, I'm thinking Afghanistan under the Taliban. What has been the most effective ways to do that?
Well, I can't speak to Iran because obviously neither the Carter Center nor USAID has had any programs there. But I would say that the most effective way is jobs. And that means investment. I mean, I hate to say it, but a lot of these solutions don't lie exclusively in the government domain. So here's a story. Many women in Bangladesh work in the textile industry. If you look at the label on the clothes you're wearing, you may very well see made in Bangladesh. And the textile industry has done what it has done in other countries. You know, it's the first manufacturing industry that developing countries tend to adopt. Well, some of the factories had appalling conditions, and you probably read there were a number of fires and accidents. Almost all of them in factories run by small kind of fly-by-night concerns. There's an organization of garment manufacturers of the large, more respectable ones, which at least professed to decry those conditions. And if you ask what these women make, you'll get what seems to us to be a very low salary. Now, I'm sure you know this, but I have to tell my students who are appalled when they sometimes hear this, that you don't know how much someone makes until you know the price of rice. You just don't. And that these women would not welcome the interference of well-meaning college students because these women made the decision to take these jobs. As in most developing countries, domestic violence is an epidemic in Bangladesh. And one woman told me that not only does she have more respect and more disposable income, but her husband stopped beating her because you can't work with a broken arm. So when I say that jobs would be the first thing I would say, it's because it gives women a stature without which they can't escape some of these traps of violence and abuse.
that's great. So let's go right there. Yes, and then got another one here.
Hi, I'm Nakoshi. I'm a student. I just wanted to ask, when it comes to diplomats and foreign service officers right now, overseas as well as in Washington, how do they engage in democracy promotion overseas, considering the events that we experience here domestically? So, and I know that that's kind of something that diplomats experience their whole career, but especially in the more recent times and coming up for next month's midterm elections, in addition to the migrant crisis as well. So how do you envision diplomats right now in, let's say, South Africa talking to their interlocutors about these issues?
Diplomats are sent things called démarches, and good diplomats embroider those démarches. It's funny because, back in the State Department, people do battle over the wordsmithing of the démarche, and then when it gets overseas, of course, that's the job is to communicate the message or the policy, but not word for word, particularly if you translate, if you're speaking in a different language. So the first thing you need to do is really put these conversations in context. For a long time, the United States did lecture other countries, and we've never been perfect, even long ago. I mean, we have our history on race and on a number of other things just doesn't bear examining, and is certainly not something we can be proud of. But in this case, the thing to do, in my view, is to inject some humility, to talk, as I did, about how we were founded as a democratic country and how hard it's proving to live up to those principles, and basically to be honest about the fact that we are frightened by the threats to our democracy, and we are trying to rally our own resources to defend democracy. But I think the idea is that we have to, even if the démarche comes out merely as a bald instruction to hold fair elections and be democratic, the diplomats should, that's their job really, to put this in context, to advocate in a way that doesn't make it seem like these countries are being hectored by people who are a bad example of what they're preaching.
So I'll do this one here, and then I'll come up to you next. Right here in the, yeah, thanks.
I'm Michael Chai Kim. Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. So kind of latching off of these questions about democracy, I'm wondering what has more net gain for the United States? What should we prioritize? Should we prioritize rule of law and rule-based institutions, well, more rule-based societies over democracy? So I remember hearing David Miliband, when he was with Fareed Zakaria, Mary Slaughter, and a Singaporean gentleman, say that specifically, and it really caught my attention because, as you have experience with elections, and I remember hearing from a colleague, like many Uzbeks look at Kyrgyzstan and they're like, that's why we don't want to be a democracy, because just as you said, we're just voting for one thug over another. Why have that? Why have people who constantly fleece you and you just change them? Why we at least want to stay with the dictator that we know, not the dictator we don't know. Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. As I said, though, I changed my view, which was really, before I went to Bangladesh and observed the election, I really would have leaned much more toward Fareed Zakaria's view of this, or at least the view that is ascribed to him, and I think that's what he wrote. But I now think that even flawed elections give people a stake in a democracy that can grow and improve. And when I talked about the democratization trend, I mentioned briefly, it was such a big picture presentation that I wanted to give that there was really no time to go into depth on any particular topic. But the trend that I was describing was a growth in the number of democracies. And I don't know exactly how Freedom House or International IDEA do it, but it's going to be a democratically elected government is going to be number one. But the trend nowadays is also what's judged is the quality of the democracy. So in Freedom House, for instance, there's free, partly free, and not free. And the question of what constitutes partly free is that gray area. If you have an election that elects people who then behave undemocratically for 5 years, you're saying that's not necessarily better than living under an autocracy. I think there's an argument that could be made based on history that a lot of the countries that became democracies started out like that, but were able, and I would argue through the participation in elections in part, were able to craft stronger institutions, greater, more social capital, and trust in government.
Okay, in the front row here. Mike.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Halal Masumi. I'm from Afghanistan. And in your speech, you mentioned that America promotes equality, justice, and democracy in allied countries. And Afghanistan has been an ally for USA for over 2 decades. But what do you think that, how was the policy of USA towards towards Afghanistan, and especially towards the withdrawal from Afghanistan? And right now, the women of Afghanistan especially were the biggest allies for the US, and just because of being an ally to US, they're going through a lot of struggles that I can't even mention here, because I know, I'm more than sure that everybody knows. And you also mentioned that America is big, America is strong, and America matters because it's strong, rich, and big. What about Afghanistan and countries like Afghanistan? It's not big, it's not small, it's not strong, and it's not rich. But it has 34 million people living in it. What do you think about this, and what do you think about the policies that US has towards Afghanistan right now?
Thank you. Well, first of all, you know, the topic of this lecture is why America matters. And perhaps I should have addressed this. Certainly I thought about it when I was crafting my remarks. You know, every country matters. But I was speaking about why this country matters. And it's certainly true that larger countries have more weight on the world stage, and Afghanistan has been in conflict for 45 years, you know, for a long time, which makes it weaker than it otherwise would have been, with less energy to devote to the world stage. Here's what I'll say. I was not part of the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. There may very well be factors that were taken into account that I'm unaware of. I would not have made that decision. That's just my view. I feel that we had an obligation after our history with Afghanistan in recent years, and I understand that it was taking a long time for Afghanistan to take full responsibility for its own affairs. And one can always look at the political class in Afghanistan and wish that a younger generation had come to the fore sooner, or come to the fore in time, let's put it that way. I think there were worries about corruption, worries about cronyism, worries about politicians who were basically, not working for the future of Afghanistan. But again, I would not have made that decision. I feel that the U.S.'s honor was involved in supporting Afghanistan. But again, I didn't have access to those things. The situation of women is breaking my heart. At the Carter Center, we hosted human rights conferences, often with a focus on women. I have met a number of women from Afghanistan. Many of them are heroic, and I worry about them. So this is one of those cases where the question that Jim asked earlier is relevant. How much, what is the responsibility of a powerful country vis-a-vis people in other countries who are suffering or whose rights are being grossly violated? That's all I can say. I would not have done it, but I don't know what factors were present.
Great. So let's do one more here, and we'll do two. All right, so we'll start over here, and then you'll get the last question.
Thank you, Madame l'Ambassadeur. I have a question. So David Petraeus, ex-director of the CIA, mentioned that the outcome to the nuclear nukes that you were talking about, he mentioned that the U.S. Military would go after the Russian troops, and they would literally destroy them. I would like to get your view on this, and what would be the outcome if something such happens?
Well, I'm of two minds about this. I actually did meet David Petraeus, but that's neither here nor there. I'm of two minds about this. At first I thought, whoa, 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 where does a military officer get off opining about this? And then I thought, perhaps he got a call saying, David, we need you to say something like this. And then my third thought was, there is no way that the United States, I don't think, would change the policy that worked during the Cold War to keep us from a nuclear exchange. And that was that no US and Soviet soldier would ever find themselves face to face holding weapons. In other words, there were many proxy wars, but there were no instances when US and Soviet troops were facing off against each other. And I don't know why that would be, why that would change. So I actually don't know whether General Petraeus was expressing a personal view in contradiction to at least a strong tradition among military officers, retired military officers, not to do that, not that it's a universal tradition, or whether perhaps, he was asked to do it. I have no idea. Maybe Jim knows.
My question would be, since you mentioned that a great power can still be neutral, but if America, decides to go after the Russian troops, how can it still be neutral while doing this?
Well, America, I'm saying that we wouldn't. I don't believe we would, because that the policy of not directly confronting Russian troops served us well in the Cold War. So there may be something I don't know. I don't understand. General Petraeus is a very intelligent man. He was at the CIA. So I really have no idea in how to parse his comments. Jim?
I don't want to get into a long discussion. That's a complex question, but you say there's a tradition of retired military officers not having opinions.
They're used
You haven't been watching CNN.
No, you're right. I'm thinking George Marshall.
Whatever tradition there was is long since.
You're probably right.
So I don't know, obviously, but I would give a high degree of confidence that General Petraeus was not speaking for the administration when he spoke.
All right, good.
Let me do the last question here.
With regard to the threat from pandemics, do you think we should open our biowarfare labs to inspection by the WHO?
No, I don't know that issue. I don't really know. I suppose the issue is whether the germs that we have are safe, whether we take good care of them. But I really don't know this issue at all. I have no frame for. I doubt, frankly, that the next pandemic will come from a U.S. lab. Where it will come from is a remote village where people and animals they've never lived near before are in close quarters. That's where it'll come from. So, but I just don't understand the context of your question. I didn't know it was an option.
Well, the debate as to whether the coronavirus came from a lab. It's an open debate.
Yes, that's true. I agree. But nevertheless, the next virus is more likely to be like Ebola and many others before it to come from this other kind of transmission.
That's debatable. But even Senator Rand Paul can't find any information on our biowarfare labs. Who works there? Anything. Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey is trying to get the Pentagon to release information on the Plum Island lab because he thinks Lyme disease came from there.
Okay, I hear you. I think you're talking to you're at a topic which is beyond the expertise of anybody who's in here.
Yeah,
so
certainly
point-
mine.
point-
I don't.
I would be glad to share what I know.
That's good.
I know more than anybody else.
Appreciate it. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ambassador Peters, for sharing this time with us and being an inspiration to all of, I think, the next generation who are going to go on to similarly great careers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.